Hello everyone. So this is the last part of the chapter GDP. So in this video, I'm going to talk about some practical stuff about GDP, the real world stuff about GDP. So first, this image right in front of you shows GDP of the world. Different countries of the world, GDP of different countries of the world. And these countries are, you can find these countries in a bracket. So here we have the color scheme and the brackets. Like for example, countries with less than $0.28 trillion GDP, they are shown in a very light blue color, or I think this is blue, but you might differ. So let's agree to disagree on that. Let's move on to the other one. The second bracket is 0.28 to 1.22 trillion dollars, and it keeps on increasing. And here we have the countries with that much GDP. So for example, when we look at United States, we see that they fall into this bracket, greater than $4.97 trillion. Similarly, China also falls into that category. And when we see the developing world, we see most of the countries in Africa, they fall in these two categories, where we have less than 0.28 or from 0.28 to 1.22 trillion dollars. So African countries mostly fall in this category. So this simply means that all the countries with less than 0.28 trillion dollars most of them are in Africa, some of them are in Asia, and some in South America, and very few in other parts of the world. And when you look at Europe right here, most of the European countries have GDP between 1.2 to 2.86 trillion dollars, and you can see it from this bracket right here. They have similar color here. So you can just look at this world map and see how countries are doing according to the GDP. And in the case of Pakistan, Pakistan falls into the second bracket, which is between 0.28 to 1.22 trillion dollars. And India falls into the third bracket, which is between 1.22 to 2.86 trillion dollars. That was in 2018. All right, so let's move on to the next slide. Here we have some countries' GDP in 2018. China had GDP of $13.61 trillion dollars, which is huge. But the United States of America has the highest GDP in the world, which is $20.58 trillion dollars. And Pakistan has 314.6 billion US dollars in 2018. And Saudi Arabia has 786.5 billion US dollars, Australia 1.434 trillion dollars, and Canada 1.7. All of Europe 18.8 US dollars. So you can see that United States GDP is even greater than all of European countries. So India 719 trillion US dollars. So here you can simply see the size of the economies, how big economies are. So GDP was the market value of all final goods and services produced in a country. So for example, in the case of Pakistan, that is 314.6 billion dollars. And when you compare it with Saudi Arabia, Saudi Arabia's market is more than 2 times that of Pakistan's market. So its market size is much bigger than Pakistan's. And when you compare India's market with China's, here, you see that China's market is like 5 or 6 times bigger than India's market. By market, I mean the value of goods and services that they produce is 5 or 6 times more than India does. So you can see the size of economies here, how big of an economy these countries have. So let's move on to some other interesting stuff. So there is this critical question. Is it a good measure of welfare, GDP? What do you think? Like, we have gross domestic product of different countries. You saw different countries, the world map, as well as the GDP of different countries after that, like United States, China. So do you think, is it a good measure, gross domestic product? That is the main question. So this simply talks about the same thing. When judging whether economy is doing well or poorly, it is natural to look at the total income that everyone in the economy is earning. So this simply is asking the same question, like naturally when people look at countries' incomes, countries' GDP, they might make up their mind that the country is doing good or country is doing bad. So for example, if there is a house, their income is per month, their income is $1,000, and then there is a house, let's call it this house A, let's call this house B, and their income is $2,000 per month. But in this house, there are only two individuals living. In this house, in house B, there are, let's say, 20 individuals living. So what do you think? I mean, when we look at the income of house A and house B, we might think that B is doing good. But when you look at the population living in house B, the number of people living in house B, you might say A is doing better. So that's the critical question. So when you look at the income of a house, in our case, it's the country. Do you think that just looking at the GDP or the final value of goods and services that country produces, just looking at this figure, can we say that a specific country is doing good or a specific country is doing bad? That is the main question. So, I mean, it makes sense to have that number. GDP, looking at GDP figure, it makes sense. And but at the same time, as I showed here with these houses example right here, it's better to see how much income each person has in the house. So when you divide 1,000 in house A by 2, that's 500 average for each person. When you divide 2,000 by 20, you have how much? That's 100 for each person. So in house A, that the average was 500. In house B, the average is 100. So that's a better measure. I mean, when you divide total income by total population, income per person, that is a better measure of looking at the welfare, not GDP. All right, so let's move on to some practical example from country's perspective. So here we have GDP comparison of GDPs of different countries. This will also help you understand the critical question that we discussed in the last slide. So first, we have GDP of Pakistan and India. You can clearly see that India's economy is much bigger than Pakistan's. And then we have United States and China's economy. You can clearly see that United States economy is bigger than China's. But then we have Qatar's GDP. So the question is, Pakistan's GDP is bigger than Qatar's, right? Qatar's GDP is $199 billion. Pakistan's GDP is $314 billion. So apparently, if you just look at GDP, you might think that Pakistan is doing wonderfully well. And Pakistan is a bigger economy than Qatar. Qatar, I mean, you hear about Qatar all the time, but at the same, but I mean, when you look at GDP, you might think, oh, Qatar is nothing when you compare with Pakistan. Pakistan's economy is 1.8 times bigger than Qatar's. So Pakistan is a rich country. You might think that, right? But the reality is opposite. Qatar is super rich. They are, the quality of life in Qatar, every index, human development index, or whatever index you talk about, that is better in Qatar, not in Pakistan. But the figure of GDP shows otherwise, says otherwise. GDP of Pakistan is greater than Qatar's, but that's a bad way to look at it. I mean, GDP is one thing, but you should not look at GDP. You should look at another figure that we're going to talk about, which is called GDP per person. So let's move on and talk about that now. Here is the better measure of welfare. I mean, GDP is not a good measure of knowing whether a country is doing well or not. GDP per person or per capita is a very good measure. It's a simple formula. You divide GDP by total population of a country. So for example, in the case of China, their GDP was 13.61 trillion US dollars and their population is 1.393 billion. So you just divide that and you get this figure 9.77, which basically means that every person in China produces this much value. I mean, practically they might not be producing this much value. Some people might be producing more, or some people might be producing less. But on average, this is per capita income of China. So this simply means that if China gives every Chinese, every person living in their country equal amount of money, equal amount of GDP. This figure is will tell you how much each person owns in China. So 9770 is US dollars is the GDP per capita for China. So that's what the figure tells us. Now let's look at GDP per capita of these countries, and then we will get a better way of knowing which country is doing good and which country is not doing good. So now, first we compared the GDP of Pakistan versus Qatar. Now look at this, how big of a difference there is. $1,482 GDP per capita. That's how much GDP per capita Pakistan has. But when you look at Qatar, they have 68,793 GDP per capita, which is the highest in the world. Qatar's GDP per capita, GDP per person is the highest in the world, but their GDP is less than half that of, not less than half, but almost half of that of Pakistan. So, this is a better measure. Now let's look at India, 2010 GDP per person, which is better than Pakistan's. Look at China. So GDP of China was 13 point something trillion dollars. For United States, it's what 20 point something trillion dollars. But looking at GDP per person, there is a big difference. China's GDP per person is around 10,000. United States is around $60,000 per person, which is a lot. So here we see that United States is doing way better than China as GDP per person. India is doing better than Pakistan, and Qatar is doing better than every other country in the world. So GDP per person, when you look at that, you can get a better idea of how rich or how better each country is doing. The more GDP per capita a country has, the better chances that country has of improving lives of each citizen in their country. So here we will end this part, and I hope you understood the practical implications of GDP, and go through all parts once again, the first three parts as well as this one, and when you come back to this one after watching the previous parts, you will have clear understanding of what we are discussing here. So if you have any question, comment section below, you can post your questions there, and I will be super quick to answer them. All right, goodbye.